24th of June, 1941, and the earth trembled beneath a mechanical monster that would seal Germany's fate not through weakness, but through its own monstrous appetite. Along the dusty roads leading toward the Soviet frontier, Oberst Heinrich Müller watched as his unit's Tiger tanks, each weighing 54 tons of armored fury, ground forward at barely 15 kilometers per hour, their Maybach engines roaring like wounded dragons. What he didn't know was that these magnificent beasts were already drinking away Germany's chances of victory, 1 liter at a time. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 and Tiger, Germany's answer to Soviet T-34s, consumed fuel with an insatiable hunger that would have impressed even the most gluttonous emperor of ancient Rome. Each Tiger required approximately 450 liters of fuel to travel merely 100 kilometers under ideal conditions. In the mud-choked reality of the Eastern Front, that figure often doubled. While Allied Sherman tanks sipped a comparatively modest 200 liters for the same distance, the Tiger guzzled and demanded more, always more. Hauptmann Karl Schneider, a logistics officer stationed at Army Group Center's fuel depot near Smolensk, recorded in his diary that autumn, "We receive trainloads of ammunition, but the fuel tankers arrive half empty, if they arrive at all. The Tigers sit idle, magnificent predators starved of their lifeblood. The men call them iron coffins now, not because they fail in battle, but because they cannot reach the battle at all." According to declassified documents from the Bundesarchiv Military Archive in Freiburg, referenced here as historical context, Germany's synthetic fuel production peaked at approximately 6 million tons annually during 1943 and 1944. Yet the Wehrmacht's mechanized divisions alone required nearly 10 million tons to maintain full operational capacity. This deficit would prove mathematically insurmountable, a death sentence written in spreadsheets and petroleum molecules. The Tiger's power plant, the Maybach HL-230 P45, generated 700 horsepower, an engineering marvel that propelled the beast to speeds theoretically reaching 45 kilometers per hour. But theory and reality diverged dramatically on Eastern Front roads that dissolved into bottomless mud each spring and autumn. Tanker crews reported watching their fuel gauges drop visibly during combat maneuvers, the needles falling like thermometers plunged into ice water. Feldwebel Otto Becker commanded a Tiger during Operation Citadel in July 1943, the massive armored thrust at Kursk that would become Germany's last major offensive in the East. His crew discovered their tank could operate for approximately 60 minutes of combat before requiring refueling. Assuming the supply trucks could navigate the cratered battlefield and weren't burning wrecks themselves. "We advanced 20 kilometers on the first day," Becker later recalled during post-war interviews. "Then we sat motionless for 2 days, waiting for fuel that never came. The Russians simply drove around us. Our invincibility meant nothing without petrol." The supreme irony escaped few veteran tankers. Germany had engineered perhaps the most formidable tank of the early war years, a machine that could destroy any Allied armor from distances exceeding 2,000 meters. Yet this technological supremacy was strangled by a simple lack of refined petroleum. The Tiger became a strategic liability masquerading as tactical superiority, a steel monument to German engineering brilliance and logistical blindness that would help seal the Reich's doom. 11th of August, 1942, and General Major Friedrich Paulus reviewed fuel consumption reports that read like obituaries for German ambitions. His 6th Army, advancing toward Stalingrad, stretched across supply lines extending over 1,000 kilometers from the nearest functioning railheads. Each day, his armored divisions consumed more fuel than could be delivered, creating a deficit that accumulated like compound interest on an unpayable debt. The mathematics of mobile warfare had betrayed the Wehrmacht. While propaganda films showed endless columns of panzers racing across the steppes, the unsexy reality involved thousands of horse-drawn wagons. Over 2 million horses served in the Wehrmacht throughout the war, struggling to haul fuel cans forward while trucks themselves burned fuel hauling fuel. This circular inefficiency created what logistics officers privately termed the petroleum paradox. Moving fuel consumed nearly as much fuel as was being delivered. Major Hans Krebs, serving in the quartermaster section of Army Group South, calculated that each Tiger tank required approximately 16 tons of supplies monthly to remain operational. fuel constituting 70% of that figure. With Germany fielding approximately 1,300 Tigers throughout the war, the fuel demands of this single tank model exceeded the entire petroleum output of Romania's Ploiești fields for 3 months of 1943. "We are trying to fill the Danube with teaspoons," Krebs observed in correspondence to his superior, General Oberst Eduard Wagner, the Wehrmacht's chief quartermaster. The situation worsened exponentially with Germany's synthetic fuel program struggling against Allied bombing campaigns. The Leuna chemical works near Leipzig, producing approximately 350,000 tons of synthetic fuel annually, became a priority target for American bomber streams beginning in May 1944. Each raid forced production halts lasting weeks. Reichsminister Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, reported to the Führer in June 1944 that fuel production had dropped by 90% in some facilities, though Hitler, increasingly detached from reality, ordered operations requiring fuel reserves that simply didn't exist. Oberleutnant Werner Schmidt commanded a Tiger company during the retreat from Ukraine in early 1944. His after-action report, preserved in military archives, described abandoning 7 operational Tigers in a single week, not due to mechanical failure or enemy action, but because recovery vehicles lacked fuel to tow them to repair facilities. "The Russians didn't destroy those tanks," Schmidt wrote bitterly. "We destroyed them ourselves, with thermite grenades and tears." Perfectly functional machines rendered useless by empty fuel tanks, the Wehrmacht's fuel crisis created cascading failures throughout the military hierarchy. Panzer divisions, theoretically mobile strike forces, increasingly fought as static defensive positions. Luftwaffe fighters sat grounded on airfields, their pilots watching helplessly as Allied bombers droned overhead. Even Adolf Hitler's vaunted Wunderwaffen, the Me-262 jet fighter and the Type 21 U-boat, suffered from fuel shortages that limited their potentially war-changing capabilities. The jet fighters required special J-2 fuel, produced in quantities so limited that pilot training was curtailed, sending inexperienced aviators against veteran Allied pilots. The advanced submarines, capable of revolutionary underwater speeds, spent most of their short operational lives cruising slowly on the surface to conserve their diesel fuel, negating their technological advantages and making them vulnerable to air attack. Transportation specialist Hauptmann Gustav Hartmann documented the fuel situation's absurdity. German tank columns advancing into Belgium in December 1944 during the Ardennes offensive carried orders to capture American fuel dumps as their primary objective. The entire operation, Germany's last major offensive in the West, was predicated not on strategic goals, but on stealing enemy fuel supplies. "We planned Barbarossa and Blitzkrieg," Hartmann noted. "Now we plan fuel theft." 3rd of September, 1942, and Professor Ferdinand Porsche presented his latest heavy tank design to Adolf Hitler at the Wolfschanze, the Führer's East Prussian headquarters. The room filled with scale models and technical drawings depicted a behemoth even more fuel-hungry than the Tiger. The Panzerkampfwagen 8 Maus, weighing 188 tons and requiring approximately 800 liters per 100 kilometers. Hitler, mesmerized by size and firepower, ignored his logistics officers' pale faces and approved development immediately. This meeting epitomized the fundamental disconnect between German engineering excellence and operational reality. The Reich's tank designers, working in competition between rival firms like Henschel, Porsche, and MAN, created increasingly sophisticated and resource-intensive vehicles while petroleum supplies dwindled. Each new design iteration demanded more fuel, more specialized parts, more maintenance hours, all resources Germany couldn't spare. Diplogging. Erwin Aders, an engineer at the Henschel facilities in Kassel, later described the design philosophy as technical perfection divorced from strategic sense. The Tiger's Maybach engine represented cutting-edge automotive engineering, featuring dual overhead camshafts and precision-machined components requiring machining tolerances measured in hundredths of millimeters. This sophistication, however, created maintenance nightmares. Allied Sherman tanks could have their engines completely replaced by a trained crew in approximately 4 hours using basic tools. A Tiger engine replacement required specialized equipment, trained technicians, and often took several days, assuming replacement engines were available, which increasingly they weren't. The fuel consumption crisis stemmed partially from design choices prioritizing performance over efficiency. German engineers mounted enormously powerful engines in tanks that, fully loaded with ammunition and crew, exceeded mobility requirements for most tactical situations. The Tiger II, introduced in 1944, weighed 68 tons and featured an even more powerful engine producing 700 horsepower. Yet its fuel consumption reached catastrophic levels of approximately 800 liters per 100 kilometers in combat conditions. Crews nicknamed it the Königstiger, the Royal Tiger, but logistics officers called it the Mobile Fuel Crisis. Oberingenieur Heinrich Ernst Kniepkamp, who directed much of Germany's armored vehicle development, received increasingly desperate requests from field commanders to prioritize fuel efficiency over firepower. These requests went largely unheeded. The Waffenamt, the German Army's weapons development agency, continued approving designs based on combat performance specifications while ignoring logistical sustainability. Documents from post-war interrogations revealed that senior designers were aware of the fuel crisis, but believed Germany's synthetic fuel program would eventually produce sufficient petroleum to support their designs. This faith proved tragically misplaced. The Bergius process and Fischer-Tropsch synthesis, Germany's two primary methods for converting coal into liquid fuels, required enormous industrial infrastructure vulnerable to bombing. More critically, these processes were energy-intensive themselves, consuming approximately 3 tons of coal to produce 1 ton of synthetic fuel. As Allied bombing intensified throughout 1944, coal transport networks collapsed, creating cascading shortages that strangled synthetic fuel production regardless of facility damage. Hauptmann Peter Franz, assigned to the Heereswaffenamt testing grounds at Kummersdorf, witnessed prototype trials of increasingly absurd designs. "We tested a super-heavy tank requiring 2,000 liters just to reach the testing range," he recorded in technical reports. "The Maus consumed fuel so rapidly that we needed dedicated tanker trucks following it constantly. When we calculated operational range, the numbers were so embarrassing that we simply stopped calculating them." Only 2 Maus prototypes were ever completed, one of which Soviet forces captured near Berlin. It had traveled approximately 30 kilometers total before being abandoned due to fuel exhaustion. The engineering community's willful blindness to logistical reality wasn't limited to tank design. Germany's synthetic fuel researchers pursued increasingly exotic fuel formulations, requiring rare catalysts and complex processing, rather than focusing on production volume. When Reichsminister Speer suggested simplifying fuel specifications to increase output, chemical engineers protested that reduced quality fuel would damage precision engines, the very engines whose precision demands had created the supply crisis. 17th of November, 1943, and Gefreiter Anton Weber trudged through Ukrainian mud carrying his Mauser rifle, ammunition, entrenching tool, and 2 20-liter jerry cans of precious fuel. His Tiger Tank Company, theoretically mechanized and mobile, had transformed into a fuel-hauling infantry unit. The tank sat silent in a forest clearing 3 kilometers behind him, magnificent steel beasts rendered impotent by empty fuel tanks, while their crews became temporary pack animals. This scene repeated across every front where Germany deployed heavy armor. The Wehrmacht's fuel shortage transformed combined arms tactics into desperate improvisation. Panzer divisions, designed for rapid exploitation of breakthroughs, instead crawled forward at walking pace while their crews scavenged fuel from abandoned vehicles, siphoned tanks from destroyed wrecks, and sometimes resorted to mixing aviation fuel with diesel in dangerous improvisations that damaged engines but provided temporary mobility. Unteroffizier Klaus Hartmann commanded an infantry squad supporting a Tiger battalion in France during summer 1944. His company's primary mission shifted from combat operations to fuel security. "We guarded fuel dumps more carefully than we guarded our own wounded," Hartmann wrote in letters home, later published in a compilation of soldier correspondence. A single fuel truck represented more tactical value than an entire infantry company. Losing fuel meant losing the ability to fight tomorrow, while losing men meant only losing the ability to fight today. The psychological impact on German infantrymen was devastating. They watched their supposedly elite armored divisions, the spearhead forces that had conquered Poland, France, and half of Russia, reduced to static pillboxes or worse, abandoned altogether. During the Soviet counteroffensives of 1944, Red Army forces frequently bypassed stationary German armor, correctly assuming fuel shortages would prevent pursuit. Infantrymen found themselves defending positions their tanks couldn't support, knowing that magnificent Tigers sat useless merely kilometers away, while Soviet T-34s, crude but numerous and adequately fueled, maneuvered freely. Feldwebel Otto Schultz, serving with Panzer Division Grossdeutschland, documented a particularly bitter episode in his diary. During the retreat from Romania in August 1944, his division abandoned 23 Tigers over 4 days, not one destroyed by enemy action. Demolition teams used thermite grenades to melt the engine blocks, rendering the tanks permanently inoperable. The men cried openly, Schultz recorded. These were our protectors, our steel walls against Soviet artillery. We destroyed them ourselves because we couldn't feed them. It felt like shooting wounded horses, except horses don't require 400 liters of fuel to walk. The fuel crisis created class divisions within the Wehrmacht that corroded unit cohesion. Luftwaffe personnel and Waffen-SS units received fuel allocation priority over Wehrmacht infantry divisions, creating resentment that sometimes erupted into violence. Ordinary soldiers watched SS Panzer divisions receive fuel convoys, while their own supporting armor sat immobilized. These allocation decisions followed Nazi political hierarchies rather than tactical necessity, undermining whatever remained of professional military judgment. Obergefreiter Helmut Fischer, an infantryman in the 11th Army, experienced this hierarchy firsthand during operations in the Crimea. His units supporting Sturmgeschütz assault guns, fuel-efficient vehicles requiring approximately half the fuel of Tigers, sat idle while nearby SS units received sufficient fuel for training exercises. We asked why their training mattered more than our lives. Fischer later testified during war crimes trials. The answer was always the same. Political reliability trumped military necessity. The party had decided SS units were more valuable than ordinary soldiers, so the party allocated fuel accordingly. The systematic fuel starvation of frontline combat units had a directly measurable impact on casualty rates. Wehrmacht infantry divisions, deprived of armored support due to fuel shortages, absorbed casualty rates approximately 40% higher than comparable formations with functioning armor support. This calculation, derived from post-war analysis of unit strength reports and casualty logs, represented tens of thousands of soldiers killed or wounded specifically because supporting tanks couldn't reach combat zones. These men died not from enemy superiority but from their own high command's inability to fuel the machines designed to protect them. 29th of January 1943, and Marshal Georgy Zhukov studied intelligence reports describing German tank abandonments around Stalingrad with grim satisfaction. Red Army scouts reported discovering 72 intact German armored vehicles, Tigers, Panthers, Panzer IVs, abandoned in retreating columns. Soviet technical teams inspecting these vehicles found most mechanically functional, their fuel tanks bone dry, their crews vanished into the winter night. Zhukov recognized what German generals were slower to acknowledge. Their enemy was defeating itself through logistical starvation. Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, had monitored Germany's fuel crisis since late 1941 through partisan networks, signals intelligence, and interrogation of captured supply personnel. By mid-1942, Soviet planners understood that German armored operations were increasingly constrained, not by tactical considerations but by fuel availability. This intelligence revolutionized Soviet defensive planning. Instead of concentrating forces to oppose German armor directly, Soviet commanders could simply extend German supply lines until they snapped under their own logistical weight. Lieutenant General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army at Stalingrad, employed these insights ruthlessly. Rather than yielding territory quickly, his forces conducted fighting retreats that forced German armor to consume fuel, advancing meter by bloody meter through urban terrain. Each kilometer the Germans advanced into Stalingrad required exponentially more fuel for combat maneuvering in close quarters, for engines idling during street fighting, for retreat and repositioning. Zhuikov's tactics transformed Stalingrad into a fuel consumption trap, where German tactical victories created strategic exhaustion. Major Ivan Petrov, a Red Army logistics officer, calculated that German forces besieging Stalingrad burned through approximately 3 million liters of fuel monthly during the heaviest fighting, fuel that couldn't be replaced given partisan attacks on rail lines, Luftwaffe transport losses, and Wehrmacht priority allocation to other sectors. "We didn't need to destroy their tanks," Petrov observed in post-war memoirs. "We simply needed to make them drive farther, fight longer, and consume more." Geography and arithmetic became our weapons. The Soviet counter-offensive at Stalingrad, Operation Uranus, launched on 19 November 1942, specifically targeted German fuel logistics. Soviet armored spearheads bypassed strong German defensive positions to capture fuel depots and tanker truck parks. The Romanian 3rd and 4th Armies, equipped primarily with horse-drawn transport, collapsed under Soviet armored assault, severing the road networks supplying German 6th Army. Within 72 hours, General Paulus's forces in Stalingrad were fuel-starved, their tanks and vehicles transforming into static fortifications as fuel gauges registered empty. Soviet tank crews, meanwhile, benefited from shorter supply lines and more efficient vehicles. The T-34, while mechanically cruder than German tanks, consumed approximately 150 liters per 100 kilometers, less than half the Tiger's appetite. Soviet logistics prioritized ammunition and fuel over crew comfort or vehicle sophistication, creating a sustainable operational model that German forces couldn't match. Soviet tankists often joked that their T-34s ran on vodka and spite, while German Tigers required increasingly unavailable petroleum from distant refineries. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 demonstrated Soviet mastery of fuel-based defensive strategy. German planners concentrated approximately 3,000 tanks, including hundreds of Tigers and the new Panther medium tanks, for Operation Citadel. The offensive meant to regain initiative on the Eastern Front. Soviet intelligence, aided by the Lucy spy ring in Switzerland, knew German attack plans in detail, and constructed defense-in-depth fortifications forcing German armor to advance through multiple defensive belts. Each belt consumed fuel, eroded mechanical reliability, and stretched supply lines further. Colonel Dmitry Lelyushenko, commanding Soviet forces in the northern Kursk salient, reported watching German tank columns slow from lack of fuel during the offensive's second week. "Their Tigers would advance perhaps 5 kilometers, engage our positions, then sit idle for hours awaiting refueling," he recorded in official battle reports. "Our doctrine called for trading space for time. What we actually traded was their fuel for our space. By the time they reached our final defensive positions, half their armor couldn't advance, not because we'd destroyed it, but because they couldn't feed it." Soviet partisan forces, coordinated by the NKVD and Red Army intelligence, transformed German fuel logistics into a nightmare of constant attrition. Rail warfare, coordinated partisan attacks on German railway infrastructure, destroyed thousands of tanker cars throughout 1943 and 1944. The Belarusian partisans alone claimed destruction of over 2,000 locomotives and 15,000 railway cars, many carrying fuel. German security divisions, themselves fuel-starved, couldn't protect the sprawling rail networks supplying Army Group Center and North. 4th of July 1944, and Adolf Hitler studied maps at the Berghof, his Bavarian mountain retreat, moving colored pins representing panzer divisions that existed more in his imagination than reality. His generals had just reported that fuel shortages prevented major offensive operations across all fronts, a situation Hitler dismissed as defeatist pessimism. "Will creates fuel," he declared to the stunned officers. "Where will exists, resources will follow." This mystical thinking, divorced from industrial and chemical reality, would characterize German strategic planning until the Reich's final collapse. Hitler's relationship with Germany's fuel crisis oscillated between denial, rage, and magical thinking. When Reichsminister Speer presented detailed reports proving synthetic fuel production couldn't meet Wehrmacht requirements, Hitler accused him of sabotage and defeatism. When field marshals requested permission to shorten defensive lines to reduce fuel consumption, Hitler interpreted these suggestions as cowardice and sometimes dismissed the officers making them. The Führer's strategic calculus operated in a parallel universe where belief and willpower substituted for petroleum molecules. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, Germany's armed forces high command, witnessed Hitler's escalating disconnection from logistical reality during daily situation conferences. In February 1945, with Soviet forces approaching Berlin and fuel reserves exhausted, Hitler ordered the 6th SS Panzer Army transferred from defending Berlin to counterattack in Hungary, supposedly to protect Hungarian oil fields that were already under Soviet control. "The Führer has ordered it, therefore it will happen," Keitel reported Hitler saying. Difficulties exist only for those who lack faith in Germany's destiny. This detachment from reality created cascading disasters. Hitler's insistence on holding untenable positions prevented strategic withdrawals that might have shortened supply lines and conserved fuel. His refusal to authorize retreats trapped entire German armies in fuel-starved pockets where they could neither fight effectively nor withdraw. At Stalingrad, Demyansk, the Courland Peninsula, and countless smaller encirclements, German forces consumed their remaining fuel reserves in static defense, transforming mobile warfare into attritional sieges Germany couldn't win. Oberst Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf, a staff officer at Army Group Center, attended a situation conference in October 1943, where Hitler discussed grand offensive plans requiring fuel expenditures exceeding Germany's total monthly production. When Gersdorf carefully mentioned the fuel shortage, Hitler exploded. "Don't speak to me of impossibilities, I will hear only of solutions." The meeting continued with officers proposing operations everyone knew were impossible, creating a shared delusion that substituted for strategy. Von Gersdorf later participated in plots to assassinate Hitler, motivated partly by recognition that the Führer's refusal to acknowledge reality was destroying Germany. Hitler's micromanagement extended to fuel allocation decisions, often with catastrophic results. He personally directed fuel shipments to favored units, overriding general staff recommendations based on tactical necessity. Waffen-SS divisions received disproportionate fuel allocations regardless of their operational situations, while Wehrmacht infantry formations defending critical sectors went unsupported. This political corruption of military logistics exemplified how Nazi ideology poisoned rational decision-making throughout the regime. The Führer's faith in wonder weapons provided psychological escape from Germany's fuel crisis. He believed jet fighters, rockets, and super-heavy tanks would somehow overcome Germany's petroleum deficit through technological superiority. In reality, these weapons consumed scarce resources, including fuel, that might have sustained conventional forces. The Me-262 jet fighter program, for instance, consumed fuel that could have kept hundreds of conventional fighters operational. The jets achieved impressive combat records when they flew, but they flew rarely because fuel shortages grounded them. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS and one of Hitler's closest confidants, shared his master's magical thinking regarding fuel. In late 1944, Himmler proposed using concentration camp labor to build massive underground synthetic fuel plants immune to Allied bombing. Engineers calculated these facilities would require 5 years to construct and resources Germany no longer possessed. Himmler, undeterred, ordered preliminary work begun, work that consumed fuel, transporting laborers and materials for factories that would never produce a single liter. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commanding the Luftwaffe, competed with Himmler for Hitler's favor by promising aviation fuel production increases through force of will. Göring's 4-year plan organization had overseen Germany's synthetic fuel program since 1936, making him personally responsible for the fuel crisis he now denied existed. In conferences, Göring blamed saboteurs, defeatists, and conspirators for fuel shortages, while proposing fantastical solutions involving captured Soviet oil fields that remained perpetually just beyond German reach. 16th of December 1944, and the frozen forests of Belgium erupted with German artillery fire as Hitler launched his final major offensive in the West. Operation Wacht am Rhein, the Ardennes Offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, represented the Third Reich's last gasp, a desperate armored thrust designed to split Allied armies and capture the port of Antwerp. The plan's audacity matched its fundamental flaw. German forces began the offensive with barely sufficient fuel to reach their initial objectives, let alone Antwerp 160 kilometers distant. Success depended entirely on capturing American fuel dumps, essentially planning a bank robbery to fund the getaway car. Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper, commanding the Spearhead Kampfgruppe Peiper of the 1st SS Panzer Division, received orders emphasizing fuel capture as the primary mission. His 72 tanks and assault guns carried enough fuel for approximately 100 kilometers under ideal conditions that wouldn't exist in winter combat through mountainous terrain. "We are to advance to the Meuse River and beyond," Peiper briefed his officers. "But our fuel will run out somewhere near Stavelot. After that, we must capture American supplies or become stationary targets." The absurdity of this planning escaped no one except apparently Adolf Hitler, who had personally designed the operation over his general's objections. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, nominal commander of forces in the West, later testified that he argued repeatedly against the offensive, citing fuel shortages that made success impossible. Hitler dismissed these objections as defeatism. "The offensive will create its own supply," the Führer insisted, articulating a theory of warfare divorced from thermodynamics and logistics. The operation began promisingly. Kampfgruppe Peiper achieved breakthrough, advancing 30 kilometers on the first day and capturing several small American fuel dumps. But the captured fuel proved inadequate for sustained operations, and Peiper's rapid advance outran his own fuel tankers struggling through congested roads. By 19th of December, portions of Peiper's force were immobilized from fuel exhaustion despite being deep in American rear areas. American defenders at Stavelot demolished a fuel dump containing approximately 2.5 million liters, fuel that would have sustained Peiper's force for weeks, just before German forces could capture it. Oberstleutnant Otto Skorzeny, commanding German commandos disguised in American uniforms during the operation, witnessed the fuel crisis sabotage German tactical successes. His teams captured numerous road junctions and created chaos behind American lines. Yet German armor couldn't exploit the opportunities because they couldn't move. "We held the door open," Skorzeny later recounted in memoirs, "but no one came through because they'd run out of gasoline kilometers behind us. We fought with American weapons, wore American uniforms, drove American jeeps. The only thing we couldn't capture was enough American fuel to matter." The 2nd Panzer Division reached Celles, Belgium, on 24th of December, representing the deepest German penetration of the offensive, still 80 kilometers short of the Meuse River, let alone Antwerp. There, the division stopped, completely out of fuel. American forces surrounded and destroyed the stranded German tanks over the next several days. Crews abandoned functional vehicles and fled on foot, leaving dozens of Panthers and Panzer IVs for American salvage teams who ironically faced no fuel shortage in recovering them. Major Rolf Erhardt, a logistics officer with 5th Panzer Army, calculated that the offensive consumed approximately 50 million liters of fuel in its first 10 days, while capturing perhaps 8 million liters from American stocks. This 17 million liter deficit, accumulated at a rate of 1.7 million liters daily, represented the operation's death sentence. "We were spending fuel we didn't have to capture, fuel we couldn't reach," Erhardt wrote in post-war analysis. The mathematics of failure were obvious from day one, but no one dared tell the Führer that physics and chemistry don't bend to willpower. The offensive's failure consumed Germany's last mobile reserves and irreplaceable fuel stocks. Tanks and vehicles that survived the battle limped back to Germany with empty tanks, many being towed or abandoned along retreat routes. The fuel expended in the Ardennes represented approximately 3 months of Germany's remaining synthetic fuel production, resources that might have prolonged the war's end by delaying Soviet and Western Allied advances. Instead, Hitler's gamble accelerated Germany's collapse by destroying the mobile forces that might have conducted effective defensive operations in early 1945. American forces, by contrast, discovered that fuel abundance represented strategic advantage as important as firepower or manpower. General George Patton's Third Army reoriented northward to relieve Bastogne in 4 days, covering 100 kilometers with 3 divisions, a maneuver impossible without the fuel logistics that American forces took for granted. American tank crews refueled from jerry cans tossed from passing trucks without stopping their advance, while German tankers sat immobilized hoping for fuel convoys that no longer existed. 9th of May, 1936, and German chemists at the IG Farben facility in Leuna celebrated a breakthrough in hydrogenation technology that promised fuel independence for the Reich. Under pressure from the Nazi regime's 4-year plan, Germany's chemical industry had perfected processes converting abundant German coal into liquid fuels through the Burgess process. Hitler, attending the dedication ceremony, proclaimed Germany would never again be strangled by foreign oil embargoes. This promise would prove technically achievable, but strategically catastrophic, creating a fuel supply just sufficient to enable aggressive warfare, but inadequate to sustain it. Germany's synthetic fuel program represented extraordinary technological achievement, married to strategic miscalculation. By 1944, 18 major hydrogenation plants across Germany and occupied territories produced approximately 6 million tons of synthetic fuel annually, an impressive figure representing roughly 50% of Wehrmacht consumption. This production required processing nearly 60 million tons of coal, enormous quantities of hydrogen, and industrial facilities employing tens of thousands of workers. The program's success created the illusion of fuel self-sufficiency that enabled Hitler's wars, while guaranteeing those wars would eventually fail when production couldn't match military consumption. Dr. Karl Krauch, IG Farben board member and plenipotentiary for chemical production under the 4-year plan, understood the program's limitations, but couldn't communicate them effectively to Nazi leadership. In 1939, Krauch calculated that planned military expansion would require fuel production increases of approximately 300%, increases requiring industrial investments and construction timelines incompatible with Hitler's aggressive timetable for war. When Krauch presented these calculations to Göring, the Reichsmarschall responded, "Then we must make the war short." This became German strategic doctrine: win quickly before logistics catch up, a doctrine that failed catastrophically in Russia. The hydrogenation plants themselves represented strategic vulnerabilities Germany couldn't protect. Each facility required enormous infrastructure: coal transportation networks, hydrogen generation plants, hydrogenation reactors operating at extreme pressures and temperatures, fractional distillation towers, and chemical processing equipment occupying hectares of industrial real estate. These massive installations, visible from high altitude and producing telltale smoke and steam, became obvious targets once Allied bombing campaigns reached German industrial heartlands. Oberingenieur Friedrich Earl, managing the Perlitz hydrogenation facility in Pomerania, watched Allied strategic bombing transform from nuisance to existential threat throughout 1944. The first major raid on Perlitz occurred on 29th of June 1944, with over 100 B-17 bombers dropping approximately 700 tons of high explosives on the facility. The raid destroyed 3 hydrogenation units, killing 72 workers and halting production for 6 weeks. Subsequent raids occurred with increasing frequency, forcing Ohl's team to focus more on repair than production. By December 1944, Perlitz operated at approximately 30% of design capacity, despite round-the-clock reconstruction efforts. The bombing campaign's effectiveness exceeded even Allied expectations. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Doyley Hughes, analyzing bombing results for the Royal Air Force, calculated that targeting synthetic fuel plants produced return on investment far exceeding factory bombing or city area attacks. Each ton of bombs dropped on hydrogenation facilities eliminated approximately 200 tons of fuel production, fuel that German forces desperately needed but couldn't replace. The 8th Air Force and RAF Bomber Command made German fuel production their primary target from May 1944 onward, effectively strangling the Wehrmacht's mobility. Germany's chemical industry attempted desperate countermeasures. Albert Speer ordered construction of underground hydrogenation plants immune to bombing, But these projects required years to complete and resources Germany no longer possessed. Decentralization programs dispersed production into smaller facilities, but hydrogenation technology resisted miniaturization. The chemical processes required enormous pressure vessels and complex equipment that couldn't be hidden in dispersed workshops like aircraft component manufacturing. The synthetic fuel program's final irony lay in its resource consumption. Producing synthetic fuel required approximately 10 times the energy value as the final fuel product, meaning Germany burned the equivalent of 10 liters of coal-based energy to produce 1 liter of motor fuel. This thermodynamic inefficiency was unavoidable given chemical processes involved, but it meant Germany's coal production increasingly fed synthetic fuel plants rather than electrical generation, heating, or steel production. By late 1944, Germany faced cascading shortages: insufficient fuel limiting military operations, insufficient coal limiting fuel production, insufficient transportation limiting coal distribution, insufficient fuel limiting transportation, a death spiral of resource exhaustion. 30th of August 1944, and Soviet tanks rolled through the gates of the Ploiești oil fields in Romania, ending German access to the Reich's only significant natural petroleum source. This single event, more than any battle or bombing campaign, sealed Germany's fate. Ploiești had supplied approximately 30% of Germany's petroleum throughout the war, natural crude oil that didn't require energy-intensive synthesis and could be refined into high-quality aviation fuel and diesel. Its loss left Germany dependent entirely on synthetic production, already crippled by Allied bombing, creating a petroleum famine from which recovery was impossible. Romania's oil had sustained German military operations since the war's beginning. The Ploiești fields, developed initially by Western oil companies in the 1920s and 30s, produced approximately 6 million tons of crude oil annually during peak wartime production, roughly equivalent to Germany's entire synthetic fuel program. This petroleum supplied the Luftwaffe with most of its aviation fuel, provided diesel for U-boats and army vehicles, and furnished lubricants and specialty fuels that synthetic programs couldn't efficiently produce.